Pericles was to govern Athens for some 30 years. And under him, a lot of the philosophers came about, including, let's see, Socrates was come a little bit later, but the philosophers that we will talk about a little bit. Now, at one point, Pericles decided Athens should build a wall. Sparta protested, hey, this would upset the balance of power and make Athens too powerful. So Pericles said, maybe you're right. I'm going to tell you what, I'll come to your city and I'll discuss it with you. So Pericles left Athens and went to Sparta, but he told the people of Sparta, I want you to work day and night. Everybody that can, every able-bodied man, even women, work at putting up this wall. And when you get the wall finished, send for me. So Pericles left for Sparta and talked things over real friendly, like with Sparta. We halfway agreed with them. Then all of a sudden, someone came and said, Pericles, the wall is finished. Pericles said goodbye to Sparta and went home. In a short time, the Spartans found out that, hey, they have the wall. Pericles felt like, hey, I tricked him, I outdid him. He, in the long run, was to outdo himself. Well, war between the two philosophies, the two ideas, was almost inevitable. And this war is called the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War lasted 20 years. As much as I would have preferred Athens to win, the fact is Athens lost. Anyway, the first year of the war was undecisive. The first year, keep in mind, Sparta had no navy. Athens had a large navy, but Sparta did not live on the seacoast. Athens was able to defeat, well, it was not just a war between Athens and Sparta, it was a war between the Delian League that involved all of the cities that Athens was allied with, and the Peloponnesian League, which involved the cities that Sparta was allied with. Basically, it was a war between Greece and Greece, with almost half of Greece lined up on one side and almost the other half on the other. At the end of the first year, when they started mourning for their dead, Pericles made a speech, the famous oration that's given at the first part of your chapter, where he lauded how great and wonderful democracy was, and democracy is the best government mankind has ever come up with. Democracy will triumph. All right, excellent speech. I got to digress. It reminds me of Herbert Hoover's inaugural address. If any of you know about Herbert Hoover, he got up and made his inaugural speech and said, there will be 2 cars in every garage. We'll have 2 chickens in every pot. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We're about to see the day when poverty will be wiped out and no longer seen on the face of our great land. He made this speech in March, in October, the Great Depression started. Came back to haunt him. Anyway, so much for Hoover. Pericles, all right, the second year, the city of Sparta encamped around Athens and forced Athenians in their walls, and then a great plague broke out in Athens. And the great plague carried away a lot of the Athenians, including, by the way, Pericles himself. He was not one of the first ones to die. Now, I want to digress a little bit and give you something that's not in the book, but if you research Pericles, you'll find this. Pericles had 2 legitimate sons, and before his legitimate sons were born, he had an illegitimate son. Now, the Greeks had a strict law that illegitimate sons could not inherit an estate. Well, when the plague occurred and the war came, big war and plague, some Athenians tried to get this law changed and said, hey, we think an illegitimate son should have. Pericles stood firm, no. Illegitimate sons will not inherit. The council stood firm also, the council. Illegitimate sons will not inherit an estate, legitimate sons only. Well, first Pericles' oldest son died of the plague. Pericles at the funeral maintained what he called a stiff upper lip, no show of emotion. Shortly after, his second son contracted the plague, and his second son died. And Pericles, who believed that a man, particularly a leader, should never show emotion, and said all of a sudden he just exploded into tears and broke down and bawled like a baby, just completely uncontrollable in his emotions. Then he went before the council and said, begged the council, will you please allow illegitimate, he had one illegitimate son left, will you please allow illegitimate sons to inherit my estate? He had been against it for this time. The council said no. Shortly afterwards, Pericles himself caught the plague. He died. I don't know who inherited his estate, but it probably was not his illegitimate son. Again, this gives some about personal life, give you some idea of what Greek politics was like at that time and what the Greeks faced. The Greeks, the Athenians, the fortunes of war went back and forth for a time, but eventually a Greek army went to Syracuse and faced an army over here at Sicily. And the Greeks were then very, very badly defeated, and all the Greek soldiers who fought in the army were sold as slaves. Again, Plutarch, a later Roman, was to write story after story about these men and the things that happened. Don't worry about the name Plutarch. But nevertheless, make a long story short, after 20 years, Athens was forced to surrender. The city walls were torn down. The navy was completely disbanded. All the ships were ordered to be burned and sunk. And Athens was left desolate. Sparta thought, we've got the top now. Well, we'll see what happened to Sparta in a little bit. But first of all, as your book does, we'll digress and talk about the writing of history, or the culture of classical Greece. What we remember the Greeks for primarily. Not just the wars they fought, the disasters were, but what their culture was. The father of history is known as Herodotus, and folk I know I've said this before and I'll say it again. It's not because he was the first person to write history. It's because largely his history excluded a lot of references to the supernatural. Now Herodotus did not just write Greek history. He started his history with the foundation of the world as best as he understood it. But again, he left off reference to supernatural, so again, that's why a lot of modern historians like him. But he wrote about, his history included the history of the Jews, and he wrote about the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrians carrying Israel, the northern kingdom captive. He wrote about these events. He also wrote a history of the Persian War, where the Greeks fought with the Persians, which has come down to us. He wrote a history of the Persian Empire, and much of what we know about the Persian Empire comes from him, because a lot of the Persian writings were not copied, or if they were copied on paper, papyrus they called it, that did not last. But he wrote, his writings have been copied and recopied and recopied. He was considered the best historian of his time, and he wrote a history of the world as much as he knew about the world and as much as he understood it. In addition, shortly after him was Thucydides. Thucydides also wrote a history, but he was even more, you might say, materialistic and less, you might say, less into spiritual than even Herodotus. Now, there was a progression, folks. We'll see when it comes to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There was a progression from the spiritual to the secular in these three men, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And you see also in the writing of history. Each generation seemed to become more and more secular and less religious as time went on. But hey, this reversed. The Greeks, for a while, they were becoming more and more skeptical until they actually were questioning if any gods existed. Then all of a sudden came a new generation that completely turned around and became super spiritual again. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But for this, at this time period, they were leaving out a lot of the stories of the supernatural and the gods and becoming more and more secular in their writing. Thucydides is also remembered for his view of the cyclical. In other words, history would repeat itself. That events would happen, and then they'd happen again, and they'd happen again, recurring. And a lot of historians have wondered, are we not in a cyclical view of his cyclical, where the story goes in cycles? In other words, you go from a monarchy to a tyranny, from a tyranny to a democracy, and then back to a tyranny again, or maybe from a monarchy to an aristocracy to a tyranny, from a tyranny to democracy, democracy back to a monarchy. These things don't go around in cycles. There is an old saying, history repeats itself. Greek drama, I do remember about this Greek drama, particularly there's the stories called the tragedies. Now, when I was a kid, we'd watch the old-fashioned black and white TV, and in the old black and white TV, the hero of the story never was killed. We wondered about that. Well, a tragedy is a story where the hero of the story is killed. I mean, we watch Hopalong Cassidy, and in fact, somebody wrote an article in Reader's Digest in 1952 that the TVs ought to show the hero of a story being chased clear out of the country and deep into Mexico, just to be kind of realistic and make it look like the hero could be bad too. But in those days, the hero was a square-jawed, very clean-cut law enforcer who might get into traps, but never got very badly hurt, never got killed. But tragedy, the hero does get killed. And a lot of what you see in Greek plays is the topic of inevitability. In other words, what will be, and there is no changing. The Chinese had this also, just the feeling of predestination. What is going to happen is preordained, and you can do nothing about it. And again, one of the more famous plays is a play about Oedipus. In his play where it was decreed that he was going to die in a certain battle and he would marry his mother. Well, they kicked Oedipus out of the palace, but then Oedipus grew up and unknowingly married his mother and was eventually died in battle, all as the gods had foretold, because it was predestined. It was inevitable, and there was nothing we could do to change it. Sophocles wrote Oedipus. Don't worry about the name so much, but Oedipus, yes. Now, in this story about, of Oedipus, you get the oracle of Apollo foretelling an event. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that in a little bit, but the Greeks had an oracle to Delphi called the oracle to Apollo, where they believed that Apollo would meet with them and tell them some event that was going to happen in the future. After they developed tragedy, the Greeks developed plays that had comedy in them. In other words, the Greeks were the first ancient people we know of who put plays on stages, and eventually developed huge, huge amphitheaters. And if you know anything about this amphitheater, they were structured in such a way that an actor could stand at a certain place in the theater and talk in a normal tone of voice, and his voice would be heard all the theater because his voice would reflect all around the theater. And some of those theaters, amphitheaters, are still standing in Asia Minor, or Turkey, Israel, and in Greece. But a lot of their reflective power has been lost due to crumbling and decay of the stones. But you could, without a public address system, the audience could hear the actors, even if there were thousands of people in the audience, because the actors, the sound would reflect off the walls of the theater and bounce back in.